Hello everyone. Chapter 8 here. Um, Disclaimer at the start of Chapter 8. As you can see, much of the material for this lecture is taken from outside of the textbook. So you still have to read the textbook. You still have to read Chapter 8, okay? But you're also responsible for the material delivered in this lecture. So I hope that's clear. That will be the case for a number of the chapters going forward, where I like the material in the book and I want you to read it, but I want to add something. Okay, so that's a disclaimer that you'll see on a number of the lectures um, through the rest of the term. So, Chapter 8 is about journalism, and I think it's useful to start with kind of a question just to kind of get you thinking. Why is good journalism absolutely critical to a democracy? Well, here again, if we were in class, we could have a discussion about this, but let me just say that without good journalism, people will not be effectively informed about current events, right? And if people aren't appropriately informed, then they cannot make decisions about their affairs. And that's what democracy is. It's about the people making decisions, right, about their affairs. So you can argue that without good journalism, you simply cannot have democracy. So, and I don't necessarily think that that's overstating the case. I mean, good journalism, not only a free press, but a properly, adequately performing press is essential to any democratic system. What's the purpose of news? Well, one of the main purposes is to inform people, to educate people, right? Another purpose is to encourage public participation. What do you think about this? Is one of the goals of journalism entertainment? I don't personally like that. I don't think that. I mean, I think we should separate those spheres, the entertainment sphere and the journalism education sphere. But the lines are sort of blurred now. I think you can, and we'll talk about some of that during the course of this lesson. This lesson, I should say. So if you look at contemporary news products, they really meet the surveillance, correlation, and cultural transmissions functions of the media, and some might even say they fulfill the entertainment function of the media, whether good or bad, whether rightly or wrongly, right? So how can we define news? That's been one of the questions at the heart of the journalism scholarship. How do we define news? How do we know it when we see it? Well, I'm going to look at a couple of different ways to think about this. But one way to think about news is in terms of what they call news values. These are the things that, sort of when journalists see them in events, they can quickly identify them as important and as being newsworthy, right? So these are the things that news people value, right? Things like impact, timeliness, prominence, proximity, uniqueness, conflict, and there are some others. There are usually 9 or 10 that are listed, but these are probably the 6 most important news values that are listed. So, think about an example. I mean, there are millions of things happening, right? Millions of things happening right now as you're watching this video. But only a few things will make it onto the 10 o'clock news tonight. Only a few things will make it into tomorrow's newspaper, right? And those are the things that have, those are the events that have some of these, or maybe many of these, news values, right? They have an impact on people. If something happens and it doesn't impact anybody, it's probably not going to make the news. It's probably not going to make the news. Or if it only impacts one or two people. Okay? If I, you know, drop my phone today and shatter it and it breaks, it's going to impact me. That would stink for me, but it's not going to make the news, right? There's no impact. So it's if something impacts a large number of people, then it's more likely to make the news. Particularly if impact is teamed with some of these other news values. So timeliness is another important news value. If something just happened, right, then it's, all things being equal, it's considered more newsworthy by news people. This is just something that it's not even always conscious. It may be subconscious, but things that just happened are considered newsworthy by news people, by news organizations, by journalists, right? If it happened 3 days ago, if it happened a week ago, maybe not so much, unless we're just learning about it now, right? But this is why you have in the news, you've probably noticed this, news people will compete with one another, right? About who's first, right? Like they'll use the kind of the live news theme. They'll use the breaking news theme. They'll use the, you know, first seen on CNN or first seen on Fox or whatever, right? They want you to know that this is new, this is fresh, hot off the presses, right? Because timeliness is something that they value. Now, you can argue that this is not always healthy, because what happens in some cases is that in their rush to be first, in their competition over firstness, sometimes news people have a tendency to either sensationalize stories, and we'll talk about sensationalism in a minute, or they'll maybe get stuff wrong. They might be wrong on stuff. They might lose out on accuracy because, you know, they're rushing to get something to press or get something on the air or whatever. But in any case, timeliness is another news value. But again, it has to be coupled with something else. There has to be something else. Like, to use the same example of me shattering my phone. If I shatter my phone right now, I mean, it just happened, it's not news, because lots of things are just happening. Lots of things are happening right now, but they're not newsworthy because they don't meet any of these other criteria. You usually have to have at least 2 news values, sometimes 3, for something to really be a news story. Prominence. Are celebrities involved? Are famous people or famous places or famous things somehow involved or implicated in a story, right? If Governor Bentley calls a press conference for tomorrow, people are going to show up because he's a prominent person. If I call a press conference for tomorrow, I doubt that anybody would show up, right? Because I'm not a prominent person. Proximity is another very important news value, and you'll notice this. You'll notice this as you follow the local news. The differences between the local news there in the shoals and the national news, right? It's different. Things that happen that are close by are considered more newsworthy. So, well, let's stick to the theme of national news for a second. Some things are newsworthy in the United States, but they're not newsworthy elsewhere. If there is like I saw today that there was an earthquake, a small earthquake in Egypt, and I'm subscribed to some news, you know, the kind of Egyptian news sites. And this was big news, relatively big news in those Egyptian news sites, right? Because that's proximity for them. It's close, it's there, it's right there, it's in Egypt, it's happening in Egypt. I didn't see that story picked up anywhere in the United States. Again, small earthquake, there were no casualties. You're probably not going to see that story anywhere on the TV news, national news in the United States, or in the national newspapers. And you're certainly not going to see it on the local stuff, right? You're not going to see it like in the Times Daily or on the CBS affiliate there in the Shoals or whatever. You're just not going to see that. If something happens, if there's a car crash or something, if there's a car crash in the Shoals, that's likely, particularly if there's impact, if there were a number of people involved or whatever, that might be more likely to make the news. It's close. It's right there. It's happening here. It's in the Shoals, right? If there's a car crash in Minneapolis, it might not make the news in the Shoals. Probably won't, right? It's not close by. So impact, timeliness, prominence, proximity. These are all news values. Uniqueness is also a news value. If things are weird, if they're strange, if they're different, if they're unique, they're more likely, all things being equal, to make the news. Okay? So they have this example in some of the textbooks. They'll say, if dog bites man, that's not news. But if man bites dog, that would make the news. That would be a strange, weird story, right? And then conflict. This is a huge one. If there's some conflict, if there's something bad going on, if there are two people fighting, if there's some contestation or tension, that's more likely to make the news. Again, for good or bad. I don't know if I mentioned this example to you before. I think I may have it in an earlier lesson, but it's relevant again. When I was working at KSTP TV in Minneapolis, St. Paul years ago, I was on the assignment desk, and we once got video, those gas station security camera videos. We got some video sent to us of a woman. She was pumping gas in her car, and there was another woman next to her pumping gas in her car, so there were two women. And so one of the women just moved away from her car and went over to the other woman and started punching her. And it's a security camera video, so there's no sound. We don't know what's going on. After a while, she stops punching her. Both of the women stop pumping gas. They get back in their cars, and they just leave. So this video was sent to us. Not only did we run the story, and there was no story. I mean, we didn't have any information. Not only did we run the story, but we teased it all night long. We were like, those little teasers on the commercials. They'd be doing those little commercials, and they'd show a little snippet of the video in the commercial, and the anchor would say, "Tune in to 5 Eyewitness News at 10 o'clock for more information on why this local woman was beating up another local woman at a gas station," or something like that. And I was sitting there going, "My God, it was so bad." Honestly, it was so bad. But sure enough, we ran the story. We teased it all night long, and then the news came on, and we had no story. The anchor was the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life. It was just like, we have security, surveillance video of this woman beating up another woman at a Minneapolis gas station, and we have no further information at this time. That was it. But it served its purpose, right? Trying to get ratings. And we'll talk more about this, sensationalism, which is one of my pet peeves. I admit I'm biased. I am annoyed by a lot of this, what I perceive to be a lot of the sensationalist news reporting that goes on. But so these are 6 really important news values. If you can combine 2 or 3 or 4 of these in one, you probably have a news story on your hands. Okay, that's one way to think about news. It's one way to think about this question of what is news. Now another question concerns press performance. How does the U.S. press perform? How do they do? Well, the Hutchins Commission is interesting. This is a group of independent experts that were commissioned to do a report on the U.S. press back in the 1940s. Okay, and in 1947 they published the report, the Hutchins Commission report on the press, and there was a lot of debate within this commission of experts. Some of them thought we just need to leave the press be, and it needs to be absolutely free. Others said, no, wait a minute. If we just leave it be totally and with no controls and no constraints, then the people that control the press, the powerful people, are going to have inordinate influence, right, in the press sphere, in the media sphere. They ultimately kind of reached a compromise on this issue of freedom. They compromised on this idea of social responsibility. They thought social responsibility was the way to go for the U.S. press. What is social responsibility? Basically, to oversimplify a little bit, social responsibility suggests that the press should be basically free for the most part, but they need to be held to high standards of professionalism. And there might be some constraints and controls needed at times, right? That's kind of what they agreed on, okay? By the way, I mentioned in this slide the marketplace of ideas. Again, the marketplace of ideas is just the idea that we let all of the ideas in the marketplace, and over time, the truth will win. Over time, the best idea will win out in the marketplace of ideas. This is a really important idea that is at the core of democratic theory. It underpins democratic theory because that's the idea behind no censorship. We just let the ideas out. If somebody wants to say something, let him say it, even if it's something bad, even if it's a lie, even if it's hateful or whatever, and ultimately the truth will rise to the top. Why? Because in a democracy, or in a democratic framework, people are seen as rational, people are seen as wise, logical, and they will be able to tell the difference between good and bad, between truth and falsehood. Now, some people have criticized the marketplace of ideas because they say, well, people aren't always rational, and some of the stuff that's said is harmful, and it rises to the top. And truth doesn't always win out. So, anyways, this was part of the debate going on in the Hutchins Commission. The Hutchins Commission ends up making a bunch of recommendations. They were very critical of the U.S. press performance this is back, remember, in the 1940s. Hold on one second. Sorry about that. I got to do something better than just throwing the computer down. I got to do like some kind of a commercial break. I got to get some intermission music or something to entertain you guys while I do that. But anyway, sorry about that. So they were very critical. The Hutchins Commission was of how the U.S. press had been performing back in the 1940s. They said the press wasn't diverse enough in terms of the ideas that were being promoted. A lot of the ideas that were being promoted were elite ideas, wealthy, powerful, corporate, government, right? Elite, powerful ideas, not a lot of diversity. They said there wasn't enough competition. There was too much concentration of ownership even back then. I think now those people would have a heart attack if they were resurrected because the concentration is so much greater now. There are only 5 or 6 companies that own most of the media. But there was they complained about concentration back then, and they complained about sensationalism. And I promised we'd get back to this. Sensationalism refers to unusual, entertaining, titillating tidbits that are presented in the media, right? So when the media focus a lot on violence and sex and scandal and conflict, that is sensationalism. You know, that report that we ran at 5 Eyewitness News, KSTP in Minneapolis about those 2 women, that one woman that beat up the other woman at the gas station, that's just pure sensationalism. I mean, there's no way around it. There's no news, there's no information value there for people watching the news. There just isn't. We didn't have any information to provide. It was just something that we entertained people with, to be perfectly frank. And this is the same. We see this. I mean, all you have to do is turn on the news, and you'll see sensationalist reporting. You know, and it's in all kinds of news, really. I mean, national news, local news, political news, financial news, sports news. I mean, you name it. There's sensationalism. But, you know, why is it so important that we know what Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie's kids look like. You have media people following them around, taking pictures, and you end up with stories on the front page. Um, the emphasis on celebrities, the obsession with celebrities. That's a part of sensationalism. You know, um, Speaking of sports news, like if you guys follow football, Johnny Manziel, Johnny Football, all these stories about him. It's a lot of sensationalism. I'm not personally a defender of Johnny Manziel. I really don't care. I'm not a fan of the Cleveland Browns. God bless him. He seems like he's having some problems in his life, but obviously he's done a lot of immature and irresponsible things. But a lot of the stuff that gets on the news, it's just because it's Johnny Manziel, and there's no other real reason for it. It's just he's a famous person, and so these are sensationalized news reports. I remember stories last year running during the summer, like in August, during July and August during training camp, and even into the fall, just like mindless. There was just no news there. But ESPN was, and I'm not trying to hate on ESPN. I like ESPN, but they're very sensational sometimes, in my estimation. They were running stories about Johnny Manziel just for the sake of running stories. It would be stuff like the Cleveland Browns are thinking about adding a package, an offensive package that would get Johnny Manziel on the field, and doing like this whole drawn out report and getting experts' opinions on. It's like, what are you talking about? I mean, it's just kind of a mindless report. And you can think of, if you just stop and think, you can think of many examples of this sensationalism. Last year, there was the Malaysian Airlines plane that went missing. Do you remember that story? Tragic story. And I'm not suggesting that it should not have been covered. But CNN and Fox News went on for a full month. I kid you not. Go back to this. I remember 3 weeks after, they were just trying to find new ways to reinvent this story so they could keep it on the air. There was nothing else to be said. A plane went missing. Nobody had any idea where it was or what happened. And everybody on board obviously was dead. Okay, barring some miracle. There was nothing else to be said, frankly. Tragic story. But they were trying to keep this story alive, and it was really, for someone who's very interested in news, I mean, this is a passion of mine, it was very depressing to me. Now, maybe you disagree. Maybe you think that it wasn't sensational. I found it to be sensational. I found it to be very problematic. Bringing all these experts on and, well, what do you think might have happened? Well, this could have happened. Entire hour-long shows being dedicated to this speculation, just theorizing about what may have happened 3 weeks later, right? Just keeping the story alive because it was the what-a story that scholars talk about. Journalism scholars talk about the what-a story. It's like that thing where, oh my God, this is it. This is such a great story. It reminds me of something else. When I was at KSTP TV, this is tragic in many ways. So we got news of a building collapsing, right, in western Wisconsin. So we're in Minnesota, but it's not far from western Wisconsin. So we got news that a building had collapsed, and everybody was running around. You should have seen the newsroom, the frenzy. People were giddy. It was kind of sick in a way. I mean, people were excited because this was what a story. Oh my God, a building collapse a half an hour from here. We got the helicopter, the chopper up. We got our best news people out to the scene, live trucks. We were on our way. And it was giddy. I mean, we were trying to get interviews. We were trying to, it was the what a story. And then we got a phone call from the police that confirmed that nobody was inside the building when it collapsed. So nobody died and nobody was injured. I kid you not. I cannot make this up. One of the dudes that I worked with at the assignment desk came back to the assignment desk and he was straight up disappointed. And he said he threw down his notebook and his pen and he said, that was promising for a minute. That was promising for a minute. And I just looked at him. I was just like, and he realized, I think right away, like what he said sounded messed up, so he kind of corrected himself. He said, well, of course I'm happy that nobody's hurt, but I'm just saying it was a good story. And that is precisely the issue that a lot of people have with sensationalist reporting, right? And the mentality at a lot of the news organizations and with a lot of journalists. So, anyways, I digress. Finally, the Hutchins Commission. So the Hutchins Commission recommended stop the sensationalism, stop the concentration of ownership. The government needs to step in and break that up. More diversity. And they said that the media have to do a better job of presenting a truthful, comprehensive, and intelligent account of the day's events in context. They have to explain stuff to us. So one of the things that I do a lot of research on, and I've published in, is the American news coverage of the Israel-Palestine conflict. And one of my pet peeves is that there's no context given. So you read stories about the Israel-Palestine conflict, and you're just like, oh, okay, they're fighting. Okay, well, what's going on? What's the problem? We don't know, because the news stories don't really give us any context whatsoever. So you would learn very little about the Israel-Palestine conflict, even if you were to read every news story produced every day for a year in the New York Times about the Israel-Palestine conflict. You'd learn very little about the conflict. And not all reporting is this way. So one of the things that Marta Dunsky's pointed out, Marta Dunsky is a professor at the University of Northwestern, and she's an expert on American news coverage of the Israel-Palestine conflict. There's a whole body of literature on this. It's really interesting, in my opinion. And one of the things that she says is that the word occupation is never mentioned, and the occupation itself is never discussed. Speaking of the occupation of Palestinian territories, right, ongoing since 1967. And she says that's a major problem, and she calls that the bias implicit in the absent. That's her quote, the bias implicit in the absent. She titled one of her pieces by that name. And she says that in other countries and with other news about the Israel-Palestine conflict, it's not necessarily that way. They do talk about the occupation because it's an important part of the underlying context. So do you think the Hutchins Commission would be happy today? I would offer up that they probably would not be happy. In fact, they might be more unhappy because in many ways, if you look at some of the studies, things have gotten worse as news organizations have proliferated. Another way to think about news is with respect to the sociology of news. And I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to pick this up in part 2 of this lesson. But I do want to talk about the sociology of news, and I want you to think about news not in terms just of news values, which we talked about a couple of moments ago, but in terms of constraints that exert themselves on news production processes.